Pinklon Thomas once traded blows with legends and survived. Yet, after all these years, one name still haunts him. At 67, he's finally opening up about the one opponent who hit him harder than anyone else ever did, and it wasn't the name most people expected. Could this toughest fighter be Tyson himself? Or someone boxing fans have overlooked for decades? When people talk about the heavyweight legends of the 1980s, Pinklon Thomas's name doesn't always come up first, but it should. His journey to the top was anything but ordinary, and before we reveal the name that still lingers in his memory, let's rewind and see what shaped him into the kind of fighter who could stand toe-to-toe with the sport's most feared punchers. Pinklon Thomas was born on February 10, 1958, in Pontiac, Michigan, a place where life could be tough if you didn't know how to fight through it. Pontiac was a city of hard streets and harder lessons, and Thomas learned them when he was very young. The world he grew up in didn't offer much comfort, dreams didn't come easy there, and chances were few. Still, somewhere in that environment, something in Thomas refused to give up. The refusal to quit would later become his signature in the ring. Thomas didn't spend years in amateur gyms racking up fights or titles. In fact, he had only about 3 amateur bouts before he went pro. For most boxers, that kind of background would seem impossible. Champions usually build their careers with dozens of amateur fights, learning every trick before stepping into the professional ranks. But Thomas didn't have that luxury. In 1978, he made the leap to the paid ranks anyway, carrying strength and determination into a world where mistakes can be costly. This bold decision said a lot about the kind of man he was becoming. When he stepped into the ring, Thomas had a style that quickly made people notice him. He fought out of the orthodox stance, which was his left foot forward and right hand back. However, the weapon everyone remembered was his left jab. It wasn't just a setup punch, it had real power behind it. He could use it to control the pace, keep an opponent off balance, and even do damage with it. Now, when you pair that with his ability to take punches and keep going, you had a fighter who was dangerous in every round. He was strong, steady, and mentally unshakable. Soon enough, Thomas's name began circulating beyond the gyms and small halls. People started talking about how he stood in front of opponents most men would have avoided, how he stayed on his feet when others might have folded. That reputation made him stand out in a ranking full of big names and bigger egos. And knowing what kind of fighter he was makes his later revelation about the toughest punch he ever took all the more fascinating. Who could hit a man like that hard enough to stay in his memory for decades? Pinklon Thomas was known as the man who wouldn't fold under fire. This reputation followed him into one of the biggest nights of his life on August 31st, 1984, under the bright lights of Las Vegas. On that night, he stood across the ring from Tim Witherspoon, fighting for the WBC heavyweight title, with the world watching to see if he could rise to the moment. Tim "Terrible" Witherspoon was a name that everyone knew in boxing. He was a former champion with a strong foundation in the heavyweight ranks. He was quick on his feet, had real power in both hands, and the kind of composure that made him dangerous every second the bell was ringing. Many believed Thomas was walking into a storm he couldn't survive. But Pinklon Thomas came in with something to prove while carrying the kind of determination that only comes from a man who's been counted out before. The fight was set up as a battle of willpower. Witherspoon, the seasoned champion, was out to keep his crown, while Thomas was fighting to make history. The Riviera Hotel and Casino buzzed with anticipation. The crowd was split, with some confident that the champ would dominate, while others were curious to see if Thomas had more than a strong jab and a good story. The atmosphere felt electric. but also tense. When the first bell rang, both men stayed cautious. Neither wanted to make the first big mistake. Then, Thomas began doing what he did best while working behind a crisp with a clean jab. It was measured, heavy, and accurate. By the second round, Witherspoon was already showing signs of frustration, blinking and resetting as Thomas kept finding his face with the jab. The challenger wasn't backing up. He was staying in front of the champion, making every round a contest. Then, all of a sudden, the fight shifted when the referee deducted a point from Witherspoon for backhanding. That small moment tilted the momentum. Thomas stayed patient, kept pumping the jab, and mixed in head movement that made it hard for Witherspoon to land clean shots. Round after round, Thomas chipped away, stacking up points, breaking down his opponent's rhythm. The champion started hesitating, and hesitation is dangerous in a fight like this. When the final bell rang, the tension in the room was thick. The decision came down as a majority win for Thomas. 2 judges had him ahead. 1 called it even. And just like that, Pinklon Thomas was crowned WBC Heavyweight Champion of the World. He had walked in as the underdog and left with the belt around his waist. Now, winning the belt was one thing, and holding on to it was another. Thomas's first big test as champion came against Mike Weaver, a former title holder with knockout power. People wondered if Thomas could handle the pressure of being the man everyone was now chasing. That night, Thomas didn't simply hold the belt, he showed us why he deserved it. Round after round, he used his jab to control Weaver, wearing him down. Then, in the 8th round, he landed a right hand that ended the fight on the spot. One punch was all it took to silence any question about whether he belonged as champion. And the knockout wasn't just a win, it was a statement. Thomas had proven he was more than a man with a good jab. He was a finisher, a champion who could end a fight when the moment called for it. Yet the journey was far from over. There were tougher nights ahead, and one opponent, in particular, would leave a mark that Thomas never forgot. The victory was sweet, but life after the title wasn't always smooth. What came next would test more than his jab. The next fights were personal, relentless, and impossible to avoid. Just like we said earlier, it's one thing to win a title, and it's another to own it up. Now, speaking of the next fight he walked into, Pinklon Thomas carried a target on his back. Every challenger wanted what he had, and every round from that point on was a test of whether he truly belonged at the top. This test came crashing down on March 22, 1986, when Trevor Berbick took him into deep water and never let him breathe. Berbick wasn't a finesse fighter. He was rough, determined, and strong enough to bully anyone who didn't meet him head-on. That night, Thomas was forced into Berbick's kind of fight, and over 12 grueling rounds, the title slipped away by a unanimous decision. The belt was gone, and so was the feeling of being untouchable. A loss like that doesn't just sit in the record books, it lingers. It makes every next step heavier. Thomas had to face the fact that the small cracks in his game had been spotted and exploited. Questions started circling about his conditioning and his timing, because that night in Vegas felt like a shift. The whole boxing industry was hungry, and now Thomas had to prove he could rise again. And fate wasted no time giving him the chance. Barely a year later, Thomas was back under the lights, and this time the stakes were even higher. On May 30th, 1987, he walked into the ring to face a man who had already become a myth, and the man was Mike Tyson. The fight was billed as Hard Road to Glory, and for good reason. Tyson was 20 years old, the youngest heavyweight champion ever, and he was tearing through the division like a storm nobody could stop. He didn't just beat opponents, he erased them. Thomas knew this wasn't just a fight. He probably figured that this was survival. Moving forward to the fight, the opening rounds surprised people. Thomas was calm, his jab sharp, even pushing Tyson back at times. For a moment, you could feel the crowd wondering if the veteran was about to pull off the unthinkable. Then came the moment everything turned. Tyson's pace quickened, his combinations sharper, and by the middle rounds, the ring seemed to get smaller. Then, all of a sudden, one uppercut snapped Thomas's shoulder and broke his rhythm. Tyson pounced, unleashing a brutal flurry. Thomas stood as long as he could, even got back up, but his corner finally waved it off. For the first and only time in his career, Pinklon Thomas had been knocked down. That fight told the world something about him. Even though Tyson may have been the winner, Thomas made him work for it. Years later, Tyson admitted Thomas was one of the toughest men he ever fought, saying it took a lot of clean punches to finally put him away. When a man known for flattening opponents in seconds gives you that kind of respect, it means you showed something few ever could. And yet, the real battles were not always under the lights. Thomas carried a burden with him everywhere, which was a battle with addiction. His history with heroin and later cocaine cast long shadows over his career. Even while he was training, winning, defending, he was battling demons that had nothing to do with a pair of gloves. Those difficulties made him lose focus, caused problems with relationships, and made it tougher to get ready for a fight. Well, you see, this part of his story matters because it explains the weight behind his words. When Thomas later spoke about the hardest punch he ever felt, it wasn't just a highlight reel memory. It came from a man who had stood across from champions, eaten their best shots, fallen, risen, and fought personal wars no camera could capture. He knew what it meant to be hurt, to be tested, to survive, and to still talk about it years later. Of course, one punch doesn't tell the whole story. Thomas faced a lineup of heavy hitters in his career, but do you think the next person could actually be the toughest boxer he faced? If you stop the story there, you miss the bigger picture. Thomas spent years with men whose punches could end a fight in an instant, and each encounter taught him something new. Let's talk about Evander Holyfield. Evander the Real Deal. Holyfield was already a name worth knowing long before he ever put on a heavyweight belt. He'd ruled the cruiserweight division, where speed, precision, and endurance made him a nightmare to deal with. By the late 1980s, he wasn't just moving up to heavyweight, he was already looking to prove that a cruiserweight could hang with the biggest men in boxing. When Pinklon Thomas signed on to fight him. On December 9, 1988, in Atlantic City, it wasn't only another date on the calendar. Everyone was wondering, could Thomas, the man who had already been to the top of the mountain, still hold his own against a contender climbing fast to the top? Well, by the time Holyfield stepped into the ring that night, undefeated as a heavyweight, he still carried the momentum of a man who had completely ruled the cruiserweight ranks. The question was whether that same power and dominance would hold up against the bigger men. Could he finish a heavyweight the same way he had dominated cruiserweights? Thomas, on the other hand, was returning from a break he took from the sport and trying to show the boxing world that his best nights weren't behind him. The matchup had that air of crossroads. It was more like whoever came out of it would be one step closer to the very top of the ranking. From the opening bell, Holyfield showed why they called him the real deal. His jab was so smooth, his movement sharp, and he didn't waste time standing still. He fired off quick combinations, snapping Thomas's head back, working upstairs and to the body with the kind of rhythm that forces a fighter to fight on someone else's terms. Thomas tried to answer back, showing flashes of the champion he once was. He kept coming forward. He stood his ground, and he refused to let Holyfield turn the bout into a one-sided showcase. Still, Holyfield had an answer for almost everything. In the early rounds, he gave Thomas a cut on his right eye with a perfectly timed left hook. That moment shifted the energy, and from there, Holyfield stayed on him, not with wild swings, but with discipline and well-placed punches. Round after round, Thomas had to dig deeper with his timing slipping, and his defense showing small cracks as the younger man pressed the action. As the fight wore on, Holyfield steadily increased his control. By round 6 and 7, Thomas's responses got slower, and his punches didn't come as sharply and defensive as they should. In round 7, after Thomas had taken damage and endured barrage after barrage, his trainer Angelo Dundee refused to let him continue. Thomas's corner stopped the fight, handing Holyfield a technical victory by referee technical decision after 7 rounds. For Holyfield, it was another step toward proving he belonged among the big men. For Thomas, it was another tough night that showed how much fight he still had, even when the result didn't go his way. And also, there was more to this loss. People remembered how Thomas held up early, how he absorbed heavy punches without collapsing, and how for a few rounds he made Holyfield prove himself. The thing is, Thomas's durability was praised even though he lost. His willingness to stand and fight under pressure, the scars, the cut. Those moments of trading and covering up all reinforced what had been seen earlier. It meant that Thomas was not someone who backed down easily. The fight with Holyfield showed how Thomas measured up against the best. Holyfield had speed, accuracy, stamina, and kept pushing for total dominance. Pinklon Thomas even said, "Holyfield is real strong and deserves all the recognition he can get." Now, comparing this to Thomas's style, you begin to understand the kinds of punches and opponents that could push him to say someone hit him hardest. After Holyfield, the question isn't whether Thomas could take a punch. It becomes, which fighter left the kind of mark he never forgot? After a career of standing across from some of the sport's hardest hitters, there's one man Thomas remembers above all. And now, it's time to find out who and why this particular boxer was his toughest opponent. After facing men like Tyson and Holyfield, you might think Pinklon Thomas would point to one of those legends when asked who hit him the hardest. Surprisingly, he doesn't. His answer is quick, almost without hesitation. The name he mentioned that shocked everyone is Tommy Morrison. Known across boxing as the Duke, Morrison had a left hook that was feared throughout the ranking. His reputation was built on knockouts, highlight reel knockouts. Precisely. And on February 19, 1991, Thomas got a first-hand experience of just how destructive that power really was. That night, at Kemper Arena in Kansas City, Morrison was still a man on the rise, young, explosive, and eager to prove he belonged among the elite. Thomas, now a seasoned veteran, had seen every kind of fight there was to see. He had gone rounds with the best, traded shots with the most respected punchers of his era, and survived nights when others might have folded. This was supposed to be another test, but what happened was something else entirely. From the opening bell, Morrison charged forward with the confidence of a man who knew what he had in his fists. Thomas kept his guard high, trying to feel Morrison out, looking for angles. Before anyone knew it, Morrison gave a left hook punch that slammed into Thomas's ribs, and for a split second, his body didn't respond. His leg buckled, and the shock of it traveled through him like a jolt, the kind that makes breathing suddenly feel different. Before he could recover, another shot landed, this one catching him clean and splitting his eye. The pain was immediate. There was no time to ease into the fight, and no time to get comfortable to ride out early rounds. Thomas later said Morrison's punch felt like being hit by a baseball bat, and it showed. The damage wasn't just on the scorecards, it was on Thomas's face, on his body, and in the way he moved as the round went on. By the end of the first, his corner had seen enough. Angelo Dundee, the legendary trainer in Thomas's corner, made the call to stop it before the second round could begin. It went down as a corner stoppage, an RTD, but anyone who saw it knew that Morrison's power was the difference, and it wasn't even close. What made this night different was how quickly it ended. Thomas had been hit hard before by Tyson's relentless combinations, by Holyfield's precise counters, but those fights gave him time to adjust. He had moments to fight back and show his heart. However, Morrison never gave him that chance. One opening, one punch, and everything changed. That's what stuck with Thomas all these years later. It wasn't the loss on his record that haunted him. It was the memory of how it felt, how suddenly it all happened. Morrison himself may not have had the lasting fame of Tyson or Holyfield, but in terms of power, he stood in a category all on his own. He went on to win the WBO heavyweight title and add more knockouts to his record, proving that what Thomas felt wasn't a fluke. In the years that followed, Thomas spoke about that fight with a kind of respect. He literally said, "Tommy Morrison hit me harder than anyone else I was ever hit by." It wasn't about the man who could outbox him for 12 rounds or the one who could drag him through deep water. It was about the man who could hit him once and make him remember that moment forever. Morrison became that man. So, to Pinklon Thomas, the toughest opponent he ever faced wasn't the most decorated or even the most famous, was the one whose power crossed a line no other had. And that one round in Kansas City became the night that defined what tough really meant. Was Pinklon Thomas right to rank Morrison above legends like Tyson and Holyfield? Or was that a sign of how far his career had slipped by 1991? Tell us what you think in the comment section below. Don't forget to like this video, share, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.